apologize for the delay. We were voting on the floor, so thank you for your patience. Ladies and gentlemen, witnesses, distinguished guests, call this hearing to order. The hearing is entitled 10 Years Later, the Status of the United Nations Human Rights Council. It will be comprised of two panels. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement. 70 years ago, in the aftermath of the Holocaust and the terrors of fascism and National Socialism, much of the international community recognized the desperate need for a renewed commitment to protecting the fundamental human rights of every individual. In 1946, UN Human Rights Commission was created for this very purpose, and this commission was to reflect a global effort to establish human rights norms across the globe and encourage their protection in every nation. Yet, over the course of the next 60 years, the Commission lost much, if not all, of its credibility. Its members frequently included nations who were themselves responsible for allowing or perpetrating egregious human rights violations. And the Commission condemned issues selectively, often avoiding obvious abuses, thanks to the work of members more interested in protecting their own appalling records than addressing real issues. At the same time, the Commission maintained a persistent bias against Israel, leveling an inordinate amount of time and resources at a single state while other concerns were left unaddressed. And that's why in 2006, the Commission was retired and replaced by the new, slightly smaller UN Human Rights Council. In its founding resolution, this new 47-member body was tasked by the General Assembly with, quote, addressing situations of violations of human rights, including gross and systematic violations, and the Council was to be guided by the principles of universality, impartiality, objectivity, non-selectivity, end quote. In addition, the General Assembly stipulated that nations elected to the Council shall uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights, shall fully cooperate with the Council, end quote. 10 years later, many questions remain as to how effectively the Council has achieved these ideals and overcome the legacy of its predecessor. At the same time, there can be no question of the need for stronger international action to ensure the protection of fundamental human rights. According to Freedom House's most recent Freedom in the World report, less than half of the world's population enjoys sufficient political rights and civil liberties to be considered free. Over the last decade, 105 countries have seen a net decline in their scores on this report, while only 61 have experienced a net improvement. In March, U.S. House of Representatives, the State Department acknowledged and condemned the genocide currently being perpetrated against religious minorities in the Middle East by the so-called Islamic State. While this is an important and commendable step, it only begins to address the enormous threats to freedom of religion and belief the world faces today. In its most recent report on the latest trends in religious restrictions and hostilities, the Pew Research Center concluded that 77% of the world's population is living in countries with high or very high levels of restrictions on religion. We must also not forget the millions of men, women, and children who continue to be trafficked as modern-day slaves, both domestically and across international borders. According to the U.S. State Department's most recent Trafficking in Persons report, 156 countries have yet to fully comply with the minimum standards of the Victims of Trafficking and Violent Protection Act in 2000, which include, among other things, that, quote, the government of the country should make serious and sustained efforts to eliminate severe forms of trafficking in persons, end quote. Given these and many other monumental human rights challenges in existence today, it is only fitting that we examine the status of what is arguably the world's highest profile mechanism for confronting these challenges. Has the now 10-year-old Council improved upon the lackluster reputation of its predecessor, and is it effectively and impartially addressing the the gross and systematic violations of human rights that we see today. These are not merely questions for intellectual debate. The actions of the Council, or lack thereof, can either promote or hinder the growth of many different freedoms worldwide and have the potential to impact countless lives. What's more, the United States currently provides more than 1/5 of the UN's funding, with contributions allowed to be made available to the Council when the Secretary of State considers our participation to be in the national interest. Those funds appropriated by Congress must only be used to support a Council whose work can truly be considered, quote, balanced, credible, and effective, end quote. One of, if not the greatest impediments to a credible Council remains its insistence on keeping Israel as a permanent standalone item on the Council's agenda. While every country deserves scrutiny, no other single country in the world has ever been subjected to this level of attention by the Council or made a standing agenda item for the Council. And I would like to use this opportunity to publicly call for the removal of Israel from the Council's standing agenda. With that, I look forward to hearing the testimony of our many distinguished witnesses here today as we explore the status of the Council, areas for potential improvement, and our best options for encouraging reform. I'll introduce the first panel in the order of their presentations. First, Aaron Barkley is a career member of the Senior Executive Service and currently serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. Prior to assuming this position, she was the Acting Assistant Secretary in the Department of State's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. Prior to joining the department, she was Executive Director of the Network of East-West Women, a nonprofit that promotes women's human rights in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Ms. Barkley has been an adjunct professor of international women's human rights at Georgetown University Law Center and George Mason University. Secondly, we have Ambassador Keith Harper. He was nominated by President Obama to serve as the representative of the United States to the UN Human Rights Council, and he was confirmed by the Senate on June 4, 2014. Previously, Mr. Harper was a partner at the law firm of Kilpatrick, Townsend, and Stockton, LLP, where he was chair of the Native American Practice Group. Mr. Harper also served as senior staff attorney for the Native American Rights Fund from 1995 to 2006, and from 2007 to 2008, he served as a Supreme Court Justice on the Supreme Court of the Poarch Band of Creek Indians. He's a member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, currently serves as a member on the President's Commission on White House Fellowships from 1998 to 2001. He was an adjunct professor at the Catholic University of America Columbus School of Law. From 1999 to 2001, he was professorial lecturer at the American University Washington College of Law. Finally, Mr. Scott Busby serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. Department of State in Washington, D.C., where he oversees the Bureau's work in East Asia and the Pacific, as well as on multilateral global issues, including U.S. engagement on human rights at the UN, internet freedom, and business and human rights. Previously served as Director for Human Rights on the National Security Council in the White House from 2009 to 2011, where he managed a wide range of human rights and refugee issues. From 2005 to 2009, he was coordinator of the Intergovernmental Consultations on Migration, Asylum, and Refugees in Geneva, Switzerland. So with those introductions, let me again say thank you for your patience. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. And we'll go in 5-minute tranches. So Ms. Barkley, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's truly an honor to appear before this commission, named for a great champion of human rights and advocate for U.S. leadership on these fundamentally important issues. As you said, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the establishment of the UN Human Rights Council, set up to replace its widely discredited predecessor, the UN Commission for Human Rights. As you know, the United States did not join the HRC until 2009, when this administration determined that our active engagement would advance U.S. interests by providing much-needed leadership to focus the Council on the most pressing and serious human rights challenges. A review of the HRC's performance prior to our membership and since 2009 shows that there is no comparison. We made the right decision. In its first 3 years, the Council failed to carry out its responsibility to promote universal respect for the protection of human rights, establishing no new country-specific special procedure mandates, eliminating mandates for Cuba and Belarus, and targeting Israel with 5 separate special sessions. Just prior to our joining the Council, the HRC in May 2009 adopted a resolution effectively congratulating the Sri Lankan government for actions that resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians. The Council oversaw a weakening of its defense of freedom of expression, allowing deeply troubling measures against defamation of religion to prosper, and largely ignoring ongoing challenges to civil society throughout the world. Working in concert with our like-minded members as a member of the Human Rights Council from 2009 to 2015, the U.S. pushed the HRC to condemn violations and establish effective mechanisms as never before. A few examples. First, we focused the Council on human rights violations by North Korea, including support for the Special Rapporteur and the establishment of a landmark commission of inquiry, whose report drew worldwide attention to the DPRK's violations, including those that it said may amount to crimes against humanity, and prompted the UN Security Council to take up human rights in North Korea as a permanent agenda item. Number 2, we highlighting Iranian human rights violations, including those involving political and religious repression, and the establishment of a special rapporteur on Iran. 3, establishing and sustaining UN monitoring mechanisms of violations and abuses in Syria, particularly through the efforts of the Commission of Inquiry on Syria to help build the case for future accountability. Number 4, in 2010, creating the first new special rapporteur focused on fundamental freedoms. I hope that's not me. It's not. In 2010, the first new special rapporteur focused on fundamental freedoms in 17 years. The special rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and freedom of association's mandate was renewed in 2013. Next, promoting through HRC resolutions and special procedures mechanisms the rights to freedom of expression and association, including on the internet, the elimination of discrimination against women and girls, and the human rights of LGBTI persons. Number 6, gaining the support of 78 UN member states to join us in an HRC statement countering violent extremism while promoting human rights and fundamental freedoms. Next, we've secured the HRC's first resolution urging states to protect a child's and a woman's right to nationality. We've also established a UN investigation into violations and abuses of human rights and related crimes committed in Sri Lanka during its civil war. And finally, we've addressed the human rights situation in Burma, including anti-Muslim violence and the plight of the Rohingya population, ensuring the continuation of the Special Rapporteur on Burma. Through all of this, we've strengthened the participation of civil society organizations in the Council's work and focused more attention on the shrinking space for civil society and the threats faced by journalists, human rights defenders, and other activists. These issues were previously underrepresented or ignored altogether in the Council. Today, they're at the core of the UN Human Rights Council's agenda. The HRC's actions shine a light on the worst violations of human rights and help create space for civil society to hold their governments to account. Civil society groups in Iran and Sri Lanka have recounted how valuable the Council's resolutions have been to their advocacy efforts. The HRC's work on technical assistance and cooperation on human rights has also spurred positive changes, with many countries seeking assistance and welcoming OHCHR offices in their countries to train police on human rights, improve elections, strengthen the judiciary, and help build civil society, to name just a few. Of course, the Council remains an imperfect body. The HRC's current membership includes many states with poor human rights records. Many member states are opposed to country-specific resolutions in nearly all cases and keen to divert attention away from the real human rights challenges. The abuse of procedure, for example, hostile amendments, no action motions, objections to NGO participation, and introduction of competing resolutions is on the rise. The tendency toward block voting is still strong. And finally, the Council maintains an agenda item, as you said, Mr. Chairman, an agenda item devoted exclusively to the human rights situation in the Palestinian territories, which stands as a clear indication of its strong bias against Israel. When we are on the Council, our presence, however, ensures that there is at least one member to call a vote and vote against the anti-Israel resolutions, so that at least they do not pass by consensus. Prior to our joining the HRC, over 1/2 of all country-specific resolutions the Council adopted concerned Israel. Thanks to our leadership and greatly expanding the number of resolutions on situations in places like Syria, North Korea, and Iran, and our efforts to minimize the time and attention devoted to the anti-Israel measures, today about 1/5 of the Human Rights Council's country resolutions deal with the Palestinian territories. That's still far too many, but there is no doubt that the reorientation of the HRC to deal with the world's worst violators would not have been possible without the U.S. in the chamber as a member. Indeed, with us off the Council this year, taking a mandatory year off while seeking re-election in the fall, the annual anti-Israel Item 7 resolutions were called to a vote at last month's session, but without any country voting no. In this year off the UN Human Rights Council, the U.S. is engaged as ever in supporting the Council as it acts in furtherance of its mandate, promoting universal respect for the protection of human rights worldwide. We intend to continue working closely with our friends and adversaries alike to help shape its agenda, fight bias against Israel, and advocate for a membership committed to taking on human rights challenges with courage and principled conviction. More can and must be done to expose and promote accountability for human rights violators and promote the values that we as Americans hold dear. Thanks to our active engagement and leadership, the UN Human Rights Council is rather much closer to meeting its purpose and potential, and considerably more effective than it used to be. Our national interest is served when multilateral institutions like the HRC work according to their missions affecting change, however incremental at times, in situations that require collective action or in which our efforts alone would be easily dismissed as politically motivated. Without the U.S. and fellow democratic states on the Council, the HRC would quickly become irrelevant or much worse. With us there, we will continue to have a powerful voice in determining its course and helping it live up to its mission as the world's foremost human rights body. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady. Mr. Ambassador, you recognize 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased and honored to testify before the Commission today. This Commission is a manifestation of the United States' core commitment to universal human rights. Likewise, the United States' engagement at the Human Rights Council represents our firm belief that human rights is and should be a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy, both bilaterally and through multilateral institutions. Greater respect and adherence to human rights norms is the effective basis for a safer, more secure, and more prosperous world. In 2006, at the inception of the Human Rights Council, a decision was made that the United States would neither seek nor seriously engage at the Council. Among the principal reasons for this decision not to engage was the structural bias against the State of Israel, fear that the Council would not focus attention on the major human rights violating states, and that the Council would include some of the worst human rights violators as its members. The policy of non-engagement with the Council lasted about 4 years. As Deputy Assistant Secretary Barkley just noted, in 2009, President Obama changed that posture, based on the idea that if we wanted the principal international body to be effective in promoting and protecting human rights, the United States would have to fully engage at the Human Rights Council. We are at an important moment. We have 4 years when the United States did not seek and was not engaged at the Council, and 6 years when we have been engaged. The history offers us now a rare opportunity to assess the important question, comparing and contrasting when the U.S. was and was not engaged at the Human Rights Council, and ask which led to better results. And the results could not be more clear. U.S. engagement and leadership matters. By virtually any measure, the Council has been able to discharge its duty to promote and protect human rights far better with an active United States working with our partners. What the last 6 years have shown is that when we engage, the Council can be an instrument to point a spotlight on the worst human rights violating countries. Countries like Syria and South Sudan, Iran and Ukraine, and the Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine, Sudan and Burma, Burundi and North Korea. This is not to say that the Council is an institution without serious flaws. The fact is, and let me be unmistakably clear on this point, the Council has demonstrated a bias against the State of Israel. We work constantly to chip away at that bias, but the bias is structural in nature. Under the, as Mr. Chairman, you noted, the item 7 of the Council standing agenda. As Secretary Kerry said when speaking to the Council last year, and reiterated by Deputy Secretary Blinken this year, the continuing bias on Israel undermines the very credibility of the Council. But in my mind, that there is a bias does not answer the question of whether the United States should engage at the Council. The question can be more effective, can we be more effective in addressing the bias with or without U.S. engagement? In 2006, and on this I'd like to go over some of the data to compare and contrast. In 2006, the first year of the Council, when the U.S. did not seriously engage, the Council passed 7 resolutions on country-specific situations. There were other decisions of the Council, but 7 resolutions. All 7 resolutions were on Israel. 7 resolutions, 7 condemning Israel. No resolution condemning Sudan or North Korea or Iran or any of the other countries with horrible human rights records and ongoing serious situations. Let us compare what happened last year. In 2015, the Human Rights Council passed a total of 31 resolutions addressing individual country situations in the standing agenda items 10, 2, 4, and then, of course, 7. These included 3 on Syria, 2 on Burundi, and 2 on Burma, as well as resolutions on North Korea, Iran, South Sudan, Eritrea, Libya, Ukraine, Central African Republic, and countries addressing the scourge of Boko Haram, and numerous other countries. Still, as Deputy Assistant Secretary Barkley noted, too much of a focus, but one can see the marked change in the attention that is brought through U.S. Active engagement. Let me note one other item, special sessions. Special sessions are where the Council sees a situation that is so grave and so serious, it should not wait for the next Council session. And so it calls special session by getting 16 country members of the Council to sign a letter asking for such a session. These are considered the most serious situations around. In the 4 years, in the first 4 years of the Council, there were 6 special sessions on Israel, 6 out of a total of 12 special sessions. In the last 6 years, with the U.S. fully engaged, with our ambassadors in place, there's been 1 special session on Israel in that 6-year period. 6 in 4 years, 1 in the following 6 years. Let me put a little bit finer point on it. In 2006, there were 3 special sessions on Israel and 1 on Darfur. In 2011, there were 4 special sessions total, 1 on Libya, 3 on the human rights disaster in Syria, none on the State of Israel. And so it is not that there is not a bias, but the fact is when we engage at the Council, when we work with our partners, we can take the Council apparatus and point it at the human rights situations that deserve the most attention. And we've seen this in the fundamental shift with respect to special sessions. Let me just also highlight some of the issues that Deputy Assistant Secretary Aaron Barkley was talking about. I want to talk about 3 examples in particular. First, on North Korea. In North Korea, the Council established a commission of inquiry that did an incredibly well done and documented report, oftentimes referred to as the Kirby Commission report. This report, detailed evidence-based report with specific, based on specific testimony of various victims' witnesses, has fundamentally changed this conversation about human rights in North Korea. There were states before this report that defended North Korea and said, hey, these are accusations and the situation isn't as bad as some countries are saying. They don't make that argument anymore. They say we should have a different tack at how to address the situation in North Korea, but they do not challenge the facts because we have a strong report coming out of the United Nations. So this has fundamentally changed this conversation on North Korea. Another good example is Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, led by the United States working with some key partners, there was a resolution passed that created an investigatory commission on the end of the LTTE conflict in 2010, and also some of the other human rights abuses and violations in Sri Lanka. At the time, President Rajapaksa took a very stubborn, negative, hostile position to the Human Rights Council, refused to have any accountability mechanism for the end of the LTTE conflict. This investigation led to a dramatic shift in the politics in Sri Lanka, and ultimately, among other things, led to a change through the January 8th election of President Sirisena. That shift led to a completely different posture, a different attitude from Sri Lanka regarding the necessity for an accountability mechanism as the basis of ultimate reconciliation. And so we see in this instance a direct link between actions taken at the Council and changes on the ground in a profound and measurable way in a country. Now, I want to be clear, Sri Lanka has a long road ahead, and it's just at the beginning of a process to put in place a serious accountability mechanism, but we shouldn't not forget the shift that has occurred and the value of that shift. Most recently, the United States led the call for a special session on Burundi. As you know, since President Nkurunziza decided not to run for a third term, it's led to significant instability. Numerous human rights violations, torture, extrajudicial killings, reports of mass graves. We called for a special session in the December timeframe of 2015 and passed a very strong resolution that created an investigatory mechanism under the High Commissioner's auspices. This, combined with actions at the United Nations Security Council and actions taken by the African Union, has led to somewhat of a different place that Burundi is at. They're not so much. There isn't the same level of fear of going into a mass atrocity situation. This is not to say that we shouldn't still pay attention to Burundi. I mean, it's still an ongoing situation, but this kind of action can bring the world's attention to these important situations. Finally, as noted by the co-chairman, we just, along with 12 countries, ran a joint statement on the deteriorating human rights situation in China. As you know, with the arrest of numerous human rights defenders, the lawyers, and then the kidnappings of individuals from both Hong Kong and Thailand, we felt the need to draw a line in the sand, and we did so through a joint statement. There's numerous other actions that the Council takes. There's the Universal Periodic Review that has led to numerous changes in country after country around the world. As my colleague mentioned, there are thematic resolutions on things that are at the core of American values, like freedom of association and assembly, freedom of expression, freedom of religion and belief, women's rights, discrimination and violence of LGBTI persons. These are important in setting the agenda for the expectations of countries regarding these core human rights issues. Mr. Chairman, the bottom line is the Human Rights Council is far from a perfect institution. It does have serious flaws, including a hyper-focus on Israel. But despite these flaws, the United States leadership can be an instrument. With United States leadership, the Council can be an instrument to promote and protect human rights around the world. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentleman, and now recognizes Secretary Busby 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and other members of the commission for bringing us together today. My colleagues, Ambassador Keith Harper and Deputy Assistant Secretary Aaron Barkley, have given you a good outline of U.S. accomplishments at the Council. Let me use a few examples to describe in more detail how these accomplishments have helped to advance human rights on the ground. I'd like to start by noting how often our actions and UN Human Rights Council resolutions are raised with our Bureau by civil society activists and human rights defenders around the world. They notice these actions and are fortified by the international recognition the Council provides. It may seem strange to us, but for people who live in repressive conditions where the government actively censors or arrests individuals for telling the truth, the simple act of acknowledgement of their situation by the international community, knowing that someone hears them, is a far greater gift than we can understand. Second, as Aaron and Keith have highlighted, there are some situations where actions by the Human Rights Council has been crucial to producing positive change, including in places like Cote d'Ivoire, Sri Lanka, and Burundi. Keith has described the impacts in Sri Lanka and Burundi. Let me talk about a slightly older situation in Cote d'Ivoire. In Cote d'Ivoire in December 2010, President Laurent Gbagbo refused to leave office after a 10-year rule and his electoral loss to Alassane Ouattara. Gbagbo instead launched a campaign of brutal repression against Ouattara and his supporters. Deeply concerned about the standoff and escalating violence, we led the initiative to convene an emergency special session focused on the abuses in Cote d'Ivoire. The HRC issued a strong resolution recognizing Ouattara as president and calling for an end to the violence. It also led to ongoing reporting on Cote d'Ivoire, including the appointment of a high-level independent commission of inquiry. The commission's reporting supported the ICC's indictment of Gbagbo, who ended up surrendering to the court. Today, the human rights situation in Cote d'Ivoire is markedly improved. In October 2015, Cote d'Ivoire held peaceful and credible elections. The UN Security Council recently lifted sanctions, and we believe the work the United States did in the Human Rights Council contributed to this result. On Sri Lanka, let me just reiterate what Ambassador Harper just said. We undertook special efforts to change the course in the Human Rights Council on Sri Lanka, helping to pass 3 resolutions over several years. We believe that the passage of those resolutions led to the delegitimization of the former Sri Lankan government and contributed to that government being voted out of office last year. On Burundi as well, as Ambassador Harper emphasized, the U.S. responded quickly to the warning signals of mass atrocity by leading the call for convening of a special session of the Council in December. We co-sponsored the resolution adopted by the Council, which condemned violations and abuses of human rights and requested the High Commissioner to urgently deploy a team of independent experts to Burundi to investigate these allegations. That team provided an oral report on its first visit to Burundi and will provide another update in June. We believe that this work with our allies in the Human Rights Council and in other multilateral fora has helped spur the needed international attention to help avert disaster. In addition to addressing situations in specific countries, our engagement in the Council has also helped to elevate attention to important cross-cutting thematic issues. For instance, early on in our engagement with the Council, we recognized that there was a significant gap in the Council's coverage of fundamental freedoms. No one was charged with monitoring the right to peaceful assembly and association. The U.S. forged a cross-regional group to establish a new special rapporteur on freedom of peaceful assembly and association. That special rapporteur has enhanced the international attention to restrictive NGO laws and attacks on human rights defenders, including those working to advance the rights of LGBTI persons. His reports have attracted a significant amount of attention and reaction, especially among repressive governments, and we think that suggests that he's having an impact. Another issue on which U.S. engagement produced a sea change in international thinking and action was the so-called defamation of religion resolution. In place since 1999, the UN's defamation resolution was a product of the Organization for Islamic Cooperation. Though it had roots in frustration over treatment of Muslims, particularly in Europe, the resolution misapplied human rights to religions rather than to individuals. The language of the resolution was also used by some countries to justify things like blasphemy and defamation laws, which are often used to imprison political opposition voices, academics, and religious minorities. Drawing inspiration from our own national experience fighting discrimination on the basis of religion and race, we worked closely with Pakistan and the UK and created a compromise text focused on protecting individual rights and what states can do to foster pluralism and combat discrimination. The resolution embodying that compromise also calls for practical and effective measures to combat religious intolerance and discrimination rather than focusing on banning speech. Subsequent to adoption of that resolution, we have been involved and launched really something called the Istanbul process, where experts identify best practices to combat discrimination and intolerance, and affirming the sincerity of our commitment to tackle the very real problem of intolerance with actions as well as words. And I should note that in that regard, we have experts from our own Departments of Justice and Homeland Security who participate in workshops with other countries to talk about what we do to combat religious and ethnic discrimination. To date, we have successfully held trainings on these issues in Bosnia, Indonesia, Greece, and Spain, and we are looking into doing training workshops in other countries this year. Finally, the HRC offers us a venue where we can work with like-minded countries to address human rights challenges across the globe. As Ambassador Harper has noted, in the March session, we were pleased to lead the first ever joint statement before the Council on the human rights situation in China, calling attention to its increasingly troubling behavior. And I would note that we received thanks from hundreds of individuals in China, both activists themselves and their family members, who felt that this statement reinforced them, recognized them, and the plight they are currently suffering. We are also able to raise concerns and make recommendations about human rights issues in particular countries through the Universal Periodic Review process, in which every 5 years, every UN member state comes before the HRC to present its own record on human rights and to take questions and recommendations from other member states. This process has elevated human rights issues within governments, the UN, and the media, and has created further space for civil society to engage in the process. The recommendations have motivated governments to make real progress on their human rights records. We have seen 100% participation by member states in this process, with many following up on recommendations which have a lasting impact domestically. In sum, we believe, as Ambassador Harper and Deputy Assistant Secretary Barkley have said, that U.S. engagement in the HRC has helped advance the ball on human rights in a variety of places and a variety of ways. I thank you for your interest in our work and welcome your questions.
Chair, thanks to gentlemen. Before I begin questioning, Chair notes presence of the member from Rhode Island, Mr. Sesseling. Do you desire an opening statement?
Just briefly. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for calling this timely and important hearing. The United Nations Human Rights Council is of tremendous importance to the United States and our global interests, especially at a time of instability and crisis in many parts of the world. The United States leadership at the Council's 31st session early this year was critical to shaping the international community's responses to many of today's global challenges, including the situation in South Sudan, the renewal of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Iran, protecting human rights defenders, combating religious intolerance, and opposing the standalone agenda item on Israel to help prevent the Council's bias against Israel. And while the Council certainly remains flawed, I think that having strong U.S. participation has been vitally important in ensuring close examination of important human rights issues and blocking efforts to use the Council as a vehicle for criticizing Israel. I thank the witnesses for their testimony and look forward to having the opportunity to ask some questions, and I thank you and yield back.
Chair, thanks to gentlemen. I'll begin questioning. Recognize myself 5 minutes for that purpose. Ambassador Harper, we'll begin with you. As we noted in the beginning, and some of you noted in your testimony, there seems to be a blatant anti-Israel bias that undermines the council's credibility. Are there any indications that Israel will be removed from the standing agenda soon? Are there any efforts currently underway to resolve the issue? Can we expect the United States or an ally to initiate a motion to this effect in the next session of the council this fall?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. The agenda item is called Agenda Item 7, which is the standing item on the State of Israel, is in the founding resolution that was first adopted at the Council and then accepted at the General Assembly. That will be reviewed, I think the next time is in 2021. It gets reviewed at these 5 to 10 year intervals. And that will be the next opportunity to review Agenda Item 7 and its continuing viability. We agree with you wholeheartedly that this item should not exist. We take a principled position that we call a vote and vote against any resolution under Item 7, regardless of content, because it is a manifestation of this anti-Israel bias. And so we will continue to take that posture. I would note, though, as I mentioned a bit earlier, that our plan in the interim is to make sure that we are working with our colleagues to try to chip away at this bias. And we have seen a marked change because of our engagement in, for example, special sessions. With our engagement, far fewer than without our engagement. And so that's going to be our continuing posture. We will look forward to working with partners to try to remove the item at the first possible juncture that we're able to.
Thank you. Now, in March, Mr. Ambassador, the United States acknowledged and condemned the genocide of religious minorities in the Middle East at the hands of the Islamic State. To your knowledge, have any members of the Council proposed a resolution acknowledging this genocide, number one? Is the United States, if reelected to the Council, committed to introducing a resolution condemning the genocide of religious minorities in the Middle East, and referring the situation perhaps to the UN Security Council?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not to my knowledge has there been any conversation at this point about that. I will note that in 2014, in September of 2014, there was a special session of the Human Rights Council on Islamic State, on Daesh, and it led to a resolution with calling for an investigation into the human rights abuses of Daesh. As far as the genocidal acts, I think that is certainly something that we will take back to the department and consider upon our when we're once again members of the Council. At this point, I have not heard of that particular inclusion in any Council resolution.
Thank you. Secretary Barclay, some observers of the Human Rights Council have noted a lack of significant engagement by other major democracies or states with positive human rights records. In your opinion, why are many states reticent to run for membership in the Council? Do you expect other major democracies to increase their participation in the Council? Given the past efforts by the U.S. on this front, are there any new incentives for these states to increase their engagement?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. The question of membership is one that we spend quite a bit of time on in our team working through, and we will continue to encourage and support UN member states with strong human rights records to run for the Council. I think U.S. participation in the Council is a real incentive for other countries with good human rights records to get on board and work with us there. But as I said, and my colleagues have also said during their testimony, it is a UN body. And so there are 193 member states who are able to run. I think one of the challenges we have with many states with positive human rights records is that they have a very small diplomatic presence in Geneva and in globally. And so it's a heavy lift from a resource perspective for them to do that. But we will continue our outreach as we have done to countries with good human rights records to try to get them to join us on the council, sir.
Okay, and how, if at all, is the ability of the U.S. to promote its human rights agenda within the council framework affected by its observer status? And you know, if you would describe, please, the U.S. relationship with other council members.
I can start, but I'd ask Ambassador Harper to chime in since he's on the ground really working these relationships. I would say in our year off, our mandatory furlough year off the council, our workload hasn't ceased at all, and we've been just as engaged as we've been in the prior years, both here in Washington and the team out in the field. So I'd ask maybe Ambassador Harper if you want to talk a little bit about working with other member states during the year off and whether that has changed at all.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are on our 1 year off. It does make some aspects more challenging because we don't have the same level of opportunity to deliver statements or lead during the voting process. Having said that, we have a lot of partners that we work with who are members of the council, and we work closely with them in calling votes on resolutions that are problematic, in supporting initiatives that we support. And frankly, it hasn't really changed in any fundamental way the results. In the most recent session, for example, we had a consensus resolution on North Korea. We had a consensus resolution on Myanmar. And so the actions of the council are still pointing to some of the worst human rights violators. In Iran, there was a resolution that was adopted by the same number of yes votes as the prior year. So it is a challenge. It just means we have to work a little harder to get the same results, but we're prepared to do that. And we're prepared to, in addition, take actions like we did with China with broad support from partners in pointing to some of the troubling human rights developments there.
Thank you. Secretary Busby, in many particularly severe cases of human rights violations, the Council has taken little or no action. You know, in China, Saudi Arabia, Cuba, Russia are examples of states that have largely escaped censure from the Council despite serious violations in the past decade. In fact, UN Watch said this, quote, 179 of the 193 UN member states have never been condemned by the Council for any human rights violations, end quote. How do you explain the absence of action on such a wide array of human rights violation? Does membership in the Council help to insulate states that commit human rights violations from negative resolutions or actions by the Council?
It's a very good question, Mr. Chairman. First, I would highlight once again this joint statement that we led on China at the last Human Rights Council session. It wasn't formal action by the Council, but it did it was a shot across the bow and has been widely recognized by members of the Council and others as a first attempt to speak out in a coordinated joint fashion on the situation in China. On some of these other countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia, you know, our judgment is that action simply won't be successful, that these countries wield too much power and influence with other smaller, less powerful countries, and so that taking formal action simply wouldn't succeed and might set back efforts, might be disheartening. That said, we do have opportunities to speak out on the situations in these countries, and we do regularly speak out on each of these countries in what is called our Item 4 statement, which is a statement to address the worst of the worst violators. And we will continue to do that and urge other like-minded countries to do the same.
Now, currently, the U.S. State Department issues a fact sheet listing U.S. achievements at the Council at the conclusion of each regular Council session. And the fact sheet does not, however, list any outstanding issues left unaddressed by the Council or resolutions that were passed despite opposition from the U.S. What's the chance of the State Department producing a more comprehensive report or assessment of U.S. involvement at the Council, and including a list of major violations the Council should still address?
very briefly, and I'll invite my colleagues to address as well. I think it would be a long list, Mr. Chairman. I think it'd be challenging to list all of the situations or abuses we'd like the council to address. We've tried to limit our focus to those things that we think we can make a difference on in the council. So I think I personally, and I think our Bureau would be reluctant to produce such a list.
Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I think Scott is entirely correct. That would be quite a long list. The fact is that there are many situations that we would like to address that don't get addressed at the council. And we do evaluate whether or not the various instruments that we can utilize at the council through joint statements, through our various agenda item statements, during other debates at the council, whether we can then pursue things that are important to us in human rights situations around the globe. And we look for every opportunity to effectively get our views out there. And these things do have an impact. You know, we haven't run a resolution on Bahrain, but we've joined numerous joint statements on Bahrain, as an example. We have, as mentioned, a joint statement on China. So we look for the best opportunities to fully utilize the various arrows within the quiver to make sure that we're pursuing the most proactive human rights agenda possible. I would say one thing, because you mentioned the question on whether or not membership insulates council members. This last year, 2015, Burundi was elected to the council in the fall. We subsequently, 2 months later, in December, ran, along with our partners, had a joint special session on Burundi with a very condemnatory resolution that came out of that. So the answer to that is, at least in some cases, it does not insulate. And that's a good example of where, despite membership or despite getting elected to the council, we were able to pass a very strong resolution in a situation that we needed to do so.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. My time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Ms. Cesseline.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Harper, in your testimony, you noted the problematic issues related to membership on the council and a number of nations with very, very bad and deeply disturbing human rights records, including China, Saudi Arabia, Cuba, Russia, and even Vietnam, have recently been or are current members of the council. And their elections to the council appear to not have been publicly opposed by the United States State Department. So my question is, why does the State Department not publicly oppose membership of major human rights violators to the Human Rights Council? And in addition to that, what can we do, what can the United States do realistically to respond to this? Because obviously it undermines the work of the council and the integrity of the conclusions of the council and the actions that they take.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. Look, first, as a blanket rule, we do not discuss publicly how we vote or who we support for any votes within the UN system. But
that's a slightly different question. I get the idea of not expressing the ultimate vote, but I guess I'm asking something a little more nuanced. Wouldn't it be appropriate for us to say, even without adhering to that policy, that this particular country or representative is not appropriate on the council because of a long record of human rights violations, and making those general objections, both to raise public awareness of that and also to support the credibility of the work that the council does? I mean, I'm just wondering why that isn't considered.
Yeah, you know, as a matter of policy, my understanding is that we don't make those kinds of public statements on these, and you know, we can certainly take that back to see if we can get a little bit more, as you say, nuanced on how we publicly message it. We do work to encourage states with better human rights records to run for council membership. And we will continue to do that. I would note, though, that you know, this criticism regarding membership of the council, I get it, I understand it, but we should not also lose sight of the fact that despite the fact that China and Russia and Cuba and Venezuela are members of the council, that we pass a resolution by consensus on things that are our core values, like freedom of expression and freedom in religion and belief and freedom of association and assembly. And things like and things like civil society space. So these are our values that are far more often than not the things that are produced from the council, despite the fact that we have these human rights abusers who are also members of the council. It is something that we are continually concerned about. It's one of the reasons we spend a lot of energy trying to encourage states to run for the council, because we agree with you that we would like to see a council with members that share our values to a greater degree as well, to the fullest extent possible. But I also do want to note, as my colleague Aaron Barkley has mentioned, this is a body of member states, and they contain autocratic states, they contain dictators, they contain democracies, they contain the whole wide panoply that the world has, and those are the states that vote others members to the Human Rights Council. So we will continue to work on this, but I do think the one point that sometimes gets missed in this larger conversation is the fact that despite this challenge on membership and who's on the council, more often than not, those things that reflect our core values are resolutions that are passed usually by consensus.
And are there suggestions that you can make, or would you share with us some of the things you're already doing to encourage member states that have better human rights records to participate? What's the reluctance? What can we do? What is the United States doing to encourage other states to participate?
Congressman, with your permission, I'm going to turn that over to,
Sure.
because she's closer on this particular issue. Thanks.
Sure. As I said, I mean, we proactively look for countries and seek out countries in conversation to run for the council who have good and solid human rights records and who share our values. And sometimes, as I said, you know, they have very small diplomatic missions in Geneva. It's a very expensive place to have diplomatic missions. And so, you know, our support might be in our own experience for running for the council. Our support might be in sharing the need to find other friends and partners who share their values to work on the vote whipping process to get elected. Much of it is experiential. Much of it is sharing how, you know, what our experience has been and what we've seen other countries experience. And I think that both the practical information, but also the sort of moral support is important to these countries, especially small ones who are trying to break into this space to be actors, productive, positive, affirmative actors in the Human Rights Council. The U.S. standing with them is important both from a solidarity perspective as well as from a practical perspective of sharing our own experiences with them.
And are there things that, maybe in thinking about the challenges we face on the council, are there things that you've experienced that would suggest that some actions we could be taking to make us more effective or make the council more effective, in addition to obviously membership and the removal of Israel as a permanent agenda item? But are there other challenges that we face in terms of the council meeting its objective that you think might be addressed in some strategy that you're pursuing? Sort of a more general question, if there's something we haven't touched on.
I mean, I can start, and then I'd ask my colleagues. I mean, one of the things we've started doing over the course of the last year or so, as the workload has proliferated in Geneva, but yet bandwidth on all sides has not proliferated, is to do a better job internally with our own agenda, prioritizing where to spend limited resources during council sessions. And that doesn't mean dropping some on the cutting room floor and not paying any attention to them, but is figuring out internally, you know, what are our A, B, and C priorities for a particular session? How can we bring other friends and partners in to do some of the things that they're already intending to do, but in a stronger leadership role so that we can focus our efforts in other places? Some of it's just very practical in terms of what's coming up in the June session, what are our top 10 priorities, who else is playing on these bottom 10 priorities that are still priorities but need some other country to take the leadership role. I don't know if you guys have...
It's an excellent question, and we constantly try to think of new ways to improve the product. And you mentioned South Sudan. That was an example of a situation in which it was very challenging to get the African group, which has 13 voting members of the council. So it's a challenge if you don't have them with you, supporting a resolution. So we went from a situation where they weren't going to support much of a resolution on South Sudan to a situation where in this recent session they supported a creation of a commission investigating the human rights abuses in South Sudan. And I think a lot of that is working with countries and helping them understand that just because it's South Sudan today doesn't mean it's you tomorrow. That we, especially countries that have political will, we think an approach of trying to build institutional capacity and provide technical assistance may be a better way to actually improve human rights on the ground than condemning them. And yet there are other situations like South Sudan, like Sudan and numerous others, North Korea certainly, and Iran, where they have demonstrated a complete lack of political will. And in those circumstances, we have to have an approach that shines a very bright spotlight on the human rights violations that are occurring. So a lot of this is to sort of, how do we utilize the resources of the Council so that we are finding the worst situations and ensuring that we're getting the most accurate reporting and having the biggest spotlight, because what we know is that human rights violators and abusers don't like to do it in the spotlight. They like to do it in the darkness. And so it is our obligation then to have that spotlight created. And that's what we're trying to do over time in as many situations that call for it as possible.
Thank you. And just one final question. I want to congratulate you on the great work that you did in 2014 with the very historic LGBT resolution. And I'd love to hear a little more about kind of what that process was like. There was a report required, what you think is likely to follow from that. As you well know, this is an area where there's tremendous evidence of incredibly horrific human rights abuses all around the world for people because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. I know that was a difficult resolution to get through, and interested to know kind of what the impact has been since the passage of the resolution and the preparation of the report, and what you think the Human Rights Council is likely to do in terms of implementation of any actions in response to this surfacing this very serious human rights issue.
Well, Carson, you're absolutely correct. This is among the most important issues that we have addressed at the Council. We've now had 2 resolutions that have passed. The second one passed with a greater margin in support than the first one. So that's a good sign, an encouraging sign. And from those resolutions have come 2 reports from OHCHR that have documented with great specificity the abuses that are going on as far as discrimination and violence against LGBTI persons around the world. The United States perspective on this is that at some point in the very near future, we should have the regularization of this as an agenda item of the Council through the passage of a resolution that seeks some kind of a mandate. We are not in the core group. We heavily support this, but we are glad that our partners in Latin America are actually the leaders of the resolution, because I think that sort of that gives it a different kind of credibility among some states. And makes it harder for states to say that this is somehow the United States kind of dictating the cultural policy around the world. And so we're heavily supportive, and we're encouraging and working closely with them, and we hope in the very near future they will seek to run a resolution that we will work to try to get passed with the highest possible vote margin. We could not agree with you more that this is among the most important developments that we've seen at the Council, and we support it 100%.
Thank you very much. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. We will have follow-up questions. We'll send them to you in writing. There may be other members who couldn't make it today with questions. We'll send those to you in writing. We ask that you please respond. Thank you very much for your testimony and your time, your patience today. And with that, I'll dismiss first panel and call second panel to the witness table, and I'll introduce them in the order that they will make their presentations while they come forward. First of all, Dr. Mark Lagon. He's president of Freedom House from 2010 through 2014. Lagon was a chair for Global Politics and Security at Georgetown University's Master of Science in Foreign Service program, adjunct senior fellow for human rights at the Council on Foreign Relations. He was previously executive director and CEO of the leading anti-human trafficking nonprofit, Polaris. He earlier served at the State Department as U.S. Ambassador at Large, directing the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons from 2007 to 2009. He was also previously Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of International Organization Affairs with responsibility for human rights, humanitarian issues, and United Nations reform. Secondly, Ted Picone is a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy and Latin American Initiative in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. His research is focused on global democracy and human rights policies, U.S.-Latin American relations, including Cuba, emerging powers, and multilateral affairs. Previously served as the acting vice president and director from 2013 to 2014 and deputy director from 2008 to 2013 of the Foreign Policy Program. And Picone is the author of 5 Rising Democracies and the Fate of the International Liberal Order. Thirdly, Hillel Neuer is the executive director of United Nations Watch, human rights group based in Geneva, Switzerland since 2009. He's chaired the annual Geneva Summit for Human Rights, a gathering of dissidents organized by 25 NGOs. An expert on the UN Human Rights Council, he has addressed every one of its 31 regular sessions since 2006. And Neuer has published widely on international law and human rights. He's appeared in debates on CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera. And finally, Mark Lyman is the executive director of the Universal Rights Group. Previously, Mark worked as a diplomat, rank of counselor at the UN Human Rights Council from the body's establishment in 2006 until the end of 2012. And this included participating in the negotiations on the institution building package, which determined how the council would operate, on the council's midterm review, and on a wide range of thematic and country-specific issues over the course of 21 regular sessions and 19 special sessions. And during his time as a diplomat on the council, Mark consistently worked to improve the body's effectiveness, visibility, and accessibility. Welcome. Thank you for coming today. Thank you for your patience. So Mark Lagone will go first with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you including me in this hearing. 10 years in, it's an apt juncture to make a dual assessment of the Council and U.S. influence in improving it. That dual assessment, in my view, ought to look at 5 areas. First, country-specific work. In the Bush administration, we were deeply worried that the Council would actually address country-specific situations less often than its dysfunctional predecessor. Moreover, the Council retained the Commission's unfair practice of only one country having an institutionalized place on the body's agenda, namely Israel. The number of resolutions, special sessions, and commissions of inquiry inflating alleged rights infringements to the level of atrocities devoted to the Middle East-only democracy is grossly disproportionate. Active membership by the United States has, however, contributed to successes in country-specific work. I would never have thought 10 years ago that a resolution devoted to Iran could be passed not only in New York but in Geneva as well. The Human Rights Council resolution has sustained a special rapporteur when the international community and the United States, frankly, have prioritized nuclear proliferation as the pretext for deprioritizing human rights in that country. While the Security Council has been all too inert on the atrocities of Assad in Syria, allowing ISIS to grow as a second source of atrocities, the Human Rights Council has repeatedly addressed the situation. On Sri Lanka, after the United States got on the Council, there was a pronounced shift in the substance of resolutions, demanding accountability for mass atrocities committed in its civil war. And now Sri Lanka is making progress, a ray of hope in Freedom House's Freedom in the World survey, which has been showing 10 years of straight global recession of democracy. Most striking was the Commission of Inquiry launched by the Council on North Korea. No single multilateral mandate or report on human rights has changed the terms of debate more than that effort led by Australian jurist Michael Kirby. So powerful was it that China and Russia couldn't block North Korea's human rights situation from being added to the UN Security Council standing agenda. The United States may not end the qualitative and quantitative tilt of the Council's treatment of Israel, but its presence is helpful. Second area I want to talk about is thematic work of the Council, which has been ameliorated by U.S. leadership as well. The United States, as other folks have testified here, helped turn around a perverse set of resolutions on defamation of religion. I know you're seized with that, Mr. Chairman. The religious freedom issues, as am I. Those defamation of religion resolutions had given cover to states to repress religion, freedom of religion and expression. The victory that the United States brought about is precarious and vulnerable. As the single most pronounced voice for freedom of worship and freedom of expression in the international community, the United States should be on the Council. Second, a much-needed mandate was created for freedom of assembly and freedom of association, in large part because of U.S. leadership at the Council. When atrocities and ostensible democracies worldwide are squeezing civil society, that mandate is essential. A third area relates to the most distinctive innovation of the negotiation I played a small part in to create the Council, the Universal Periodic Review. The UPR gives opportunity for civil society groups to shine a light of accountability on their states. It's not widely known, but the largest part of Freedom House's work is capacity building and emergency assistance to civil society organizations in all regions of the world, and we see how the UPR helps our local civil society partners. A good example is Mali, where meetings developed between ministerial departments and representatives of civil society only because the UPR existed. UPR is not an unvarnished success. It isn't clear to me that there is a sufficient onus on states to live up to even the recommendations they agree to meet, much less those they don't. And that's one of the reasons that Freedom House feels it's important to take human rights defenders it works with, including those from Venezuela, to the bodies that are designed to treat whether countries are living up to the human rights conventions that they make commitments to. They actually have more impact. The fourth area is kicking the worst of the worst off the body. It's commendable that this improvement upon the Commission, that you could get rid of a member of the body if it was so heinous, was in fact invoked when Muammar Gaddafi threatened his own people and Libya was temporarily suspended from the Council. A second expulsion would prove that it's in fact a trend. It would build credibility. And alas, earlier this year, when the United States was taking its required year off the membership, the Council failed to bounce Burundi from its membership as atrocities were unfolding. Fifth and last is the question of elections. The Council improved on the Commission in two respects. First, so-called clean slates of candidates equaling the number of seats allotted to a region have been counteracted by the practice of transparent roll calls. Secondly, states actually justify their candidacy with a platform. They speak to the merits of their record and they make pledges. Neither of these two improvements have been foolproof. Regional groups have still put out clean slates. The Western group has indeed put up clean slates. The United States has taken advantage of a clean slate. It should have the courage of its convictions that it will win by reasonable margins. Some states offer bogus rhetorical pledges, and clearly reprehensible rights-abusing states get on the Council. In this regard, if I can make one major recommendation for U.S. policy, the U.S. should prove that it will subject an ostensible strategic ally to the same standards as other horrific autocracies, and not only oppose, but lead a campaign against Saudi Arabia, where one sees gender apartheid and heinous religious persecution. I offer three conclusions. The United States, being on the body, has improved the Human Rights Council. It's offered real value, including country-specific resolutions, thematic work, and the UPR. Second, the very flaws and pathologies of the Council's work argue not for boycotting it, but adding the United States considerable weight to counteracting it. And third and finally, let's look at the dynamics of the Council. We know that solidarity among the democracies will not spontaneously come from the emerging powers of the global south that my friend Ted writes about frequently. Brazil, South Africa, India. Freedom House's own report supporting democracy abroad demonstrates that. The U.S. and Europe have much more of a forward-leaning approach on democracy and human rights, and we shouldn't think the EU should be expected to efficaciously lead the world's democracies without the United States there. So, in short, let's get out of our funk. The United States has plenty of soft power and moral authority to offer on human rights. The Human Rights Council needs it. With the United States on it, the Human Rights Council is a glass half full rather than a glass half empty. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Now recognizes Mr. Picone for your opening statement.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman. Many thanks for inviting me to present some thoughts about the Human Rights Council and its 10-year anniversary and the role of the U.S. leadership on the body. You know, many of us were skeptical that the outcome of the debates to create the Council in 2006 were on balance positive or negative. But we also knew from the start that meeting the new Council's standards would require ongoing attention and pressure from Washington and civil society from around the world. So I applauded President Obama's decision to join the Council after the previous administration decided to sit out on the sidelines during those first crucial years. And I would argue it's fair to say U.S. leadership has made a major contribution to the successes of the Council since it joined the body in 2009. Late last year, I compiled my own accounting of the Council's first 10 years based on, I think, misunderstandings that continue to plague perceptions of its work. And I just completed a study of the Council's record on monitoring country-specific situations that demand greater attention by the UN, and I request that those documents be entered into the Commission's record.
Without objection, so ordered.
My assessment covers 5 main issues that continue to burden the Human Rights Council. First, we've heard a lot about the Council's membership. We all agree, I think, that some members of the Council do not, to put it mildly, represent the shining stars of the human rights universe. In particular, election of states like China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Cuba, and Venezuela, and newer members like Burundi and Ethiopia, is a sad testament to the General Assembly's willingness to prioritize politics over principles. But it is not the case that the majority of the Council's members are authoritarian. From 2007 to 2015, over 74% of the Council's members met the Freedom House standards of free and partly free. In addition, other states with notorious human rights records, Iran, Sudan, Syria, Azerbaijan, and Belarus, for example, have either failed in their campaigns to win a seat or have withdrawn in the face of heavy opposition. The problem with membership process is twofold. First, too often the regional slate is not competitive, giving states little to no choice when electing members. And second, some member states just don't want the trouble and expense involved in Council membership. Third, other big democracies elected to the body, like India and Indonesia and South Africa, too often avoid criticizing fellow governments or even worse. And so the United States needs to continue to work very hard to persuade more democratic states to join or become more positively engaged on the Council. But a democracy being a democracy is not enough. They also need to have sufficient understanding of how the international system can work to promote human rights. Finally, I think it's ultimately a question of peer pressure, the way the UN works, that there needs to be peer pressure from other governments, but also bottom up from citizens. And we need to continue to build cross-regional coalitions of like-minded states, which requires really active, engaged diplomacy in Geneva, in New York, and in capitals. The 10-year anniversary is a good moment to reflect on other ways membership can be improved. First, the Office of the High Commissioner should issue an annual report on if and how each candidate is cooperating with the Council. That is a criterion for membership. Secondly, regional groups could commit to run only on competitive slates. Third, states could organize a formal pledging conference to make the specific commitments uphold human rights. And then finally, I would point out on membership, we're never going to get a perfect membership. The diverse membership of the Council means it speaks with some legitimacy when it does, in fact, take action against violations in specific situations. So in the last session, we saw unanimous resolutions, all states, unanimous resolutions on North Korea, Myanmar, and South Sudan. I think that speaks very powerfully in a way about what's going wrong in those countries and the international community's views. Second big issue, country-specific scrutiny by the Council. There's an impression that the body spends too much time on these soft thematic resolutions and not enough condemning systematic violations in specific countries. It's true that the balance is much more in favor of thematic resolutions. But if we look at all the relevant mechanisms of the Council, it's much more than just resolutions. We look at country visits and reports by special rapporteurs, special sessions, commissions of inquiry, the new universal periodic review process, not to mention treaty bodies. We see a much higher level of attention to country situations, including the worst cases. The Universal Periodic Review, which has received 100% participation by all UN member states, has yielded an unprecedented global examination of every state's human rights performance. I would add that these soft thematic resolutions often include mandates that are some of the most important tools the UN has to investigate states on everything from torture to human trafficking to freedom of religion, arbitrary detentions. And these rapporteurs go into states and monitor and speak out about the violations in those countries. It doesn't mean that the most important cases are getting all the attention they deserve, but this is a function of power politics and a lack of time and resources. One remedy would be to allow other credible stakeholders a voice in triggering the country situation examinations. Third, let me jump to the problem of Council's biased treatment of Israel. As this Congress is well aware, Israel's human rights record is the only country-specific permanent item on the agenda, which was a result of some bad bargaining in the early days of the Council when the United States was inactive. And I think I won't repeat what you already heard in the first panel about how it's changed from the time when the United States was off the Council and since then. It's already in my testimony. Now, not surprisingly, Israel approaches the Council with trepidation and routinely fails to cooperate with its fact-finding commissions. But it has not walked away from the Council or from the UPR process. As Israel's ambassador to Geneva stated, Israel came to the UPR review with respect for the process, belief in the importance of its universality and cooperative nature, and with great pride in its achievements. I think the United States must continue to fight hard for fair treatment of Israel in Geneva. I think also Israel could do more to cooperate with the Council's mechanisms. This is a bit of a chicken and egg problem here. But experience shows we're much better off staying engaged at the Council to defend Israel against the unfair treatment than walking away from it. A fourth issue is that the UN is a toothless debating society and has no real impact. And as we heard in the first panel, we know from human rights defenders on the ground that actually it has real meaning when the international community speaks out against violations in specific countries. And we don't want to fall into the trap that says, oh, this is all just talk and the Universal Declaration and treaties don't really matter. There has been real impact. The real challenge is implementation of the norms that we already have on the table. And accountability for human rights violations starts by shedding light on a variety of pressing human rights problems. And we see this explosive increase in the scope and depth of the Council's work over the last 10 years, and it demonstrates a much more systematic attempt by the international community to monitor state behavior. The Council has established 20 new mandates of independent experts that act as its eyes and ears on the ground. And my research, which covers the effectiveness of these monitors, revealed dozens of stories of the impact they've had in getting prisoners released, in protecting journalists, in decriminalizing blasphemy, and reducing prison sentences. And in addition, we now have the UPR process, which is adding another layer of transparency and accountability, and nearly half of their recommendations made to states were partially or fully implemented just 2.5 years after the first round of reviews. I won't go into what has happened on North Korea and Sri Lanka and Syria. I think that was already well covered in the previous speakers. I would just underscore that greater documentation of abuses is only the first step toward real accountability. The Council and the Commissioner for Human Rights need real resources to do the field work that are necessary to build up both the documentation and the implementation work that's so desperately needed. Fifth issue, and particularly relevant to this hearing, is U.S. leadership at the Council. Some argue that the body is so tainted by politics and spoilers that we would be better off staying away from it. But I think this approach would abandon the field to those who remain determined to block any scrutiny or condemnation of human rights. We know the evidence against U.S. withdrawal. Its absence from the Council during the first 2 years led to serious setbacks, including the preponderant focus on Israel. Since the United States joined in 2009, the Council has taken a string of important actions that move the agenda forward on North Korea, Iran, Syria, thematic priorities that we heard about in the first panel. And just in this last session alone, the U.S. played a key role in securing positive action on the right to peaceful protests, South Sudan, Myanmar, Iran, Syria, and North Korea, and the joint statement on China. So the U.S. needs to stay engaged, and I think their record proves it well. I want to raise one last issue, which is the participation of civil society at the Human Rights Council, which is critical. To me, it's the lifeblood of what makes this system work. Because you have human rights defenders and other very well-experienced advocates who push governments and hold them accountable to what these principles mean. Already the Council is quite open to civil society, but there's several problems. NGO representatives invited to speak are routinely interrupted with harassing points of order from repressive delegations. There are reprisals against defenders who cooperate with the Council's mechanisms. I think a state's failure to address these reprisals should disqualify it from sitting on the Council. And then finally, there's a committee in New York called the UN Committee on NGOs that certifies whether an NGO can participate. We have to desperately reform this committee. If Congress wants to improve the situation, it should instruct our diplomats to demand a complete overhaul of the accreditation system, take it out of the hands of diplomats, and put it in the hands of professional experts who are qualified to make the assessments needed to give civil society a greater voice at the UN. Many thanks for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Very constructive. Mr. Neuer, you're recognized for your opening statement.
While the U.S. uses it to apply real scrutiny, the vast majority abuse it to praise each other. I was there when China praised Saudi Arabia for respecting religious freedom, and when the next day Saudi Arabia praised China for respecting minority rights. That's why our detailed study, available at unwatch.org, is entitled Mutual Praise Society. Let us consider where the Council is active. Despite the promise of ending selectivity, the Council's pathological obsession with demonizing Israelis and denying their human rights has never been worse. Since its creation, the Council has adopted 67 resolutions condemning Israel and only 61 on the rest of the world combined. The texts on Israel are uniquely suffused with suppression of any countervailing facts that might provide balance. Its commissions of inquiry, like the Goldstone Report, which excoriated Israel while exonerating Hamas, initiated a new era whereby a terrorist group has come to rely on this Council as an effective international tool to achieve its murderous goals. Hamas is incentivized by the Council to launch rocket attacks against Israeli civilians while placing its own civilian population in harm's way. Just now, the Council instituted a UN blacklist of Israeli companies to have the UN implement the anti-Israeli BDS campaign, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and to strangle the economic life of Israeli citizens. Finally, let us consider the special rapporteurs and other experts appointed by the Council. A number do important work, such as Dr. Ahmed Shahid, the expert on Iran, but far too many are wolves in sheep's clothing, appointed by the dictatorships to pursue radical agendas in the name of human rights. In 2008, they appointed Richard Falk, a leading promoter of the 9/11 conspiracy theory and a supporter of Hamas. I applaud Susan Rice for condemning his poisonous words when she was ambassador to the UN. In 2013, despite objections by Ambassador Samantha Power and the Swiss Parliament, the Council re-elected Jean Ziegler, co-founder of the Gaddafi Human Rights Prize, an award given to Hugo Chavez, Louis Farrakhan, and anti-Semites and Holocaust deniers such as Roger Garaudy. Ziegler is the longest-serving Council expert and himself received the Muammar Gaddafi Prize. In 2014, when Falk's term was up, the Council went ahead and appointed his wife and colleague, Hilal Elver, who, as the U.S. rightly objected, espouses equally inflammatory views. Finally, in 2015, the Council made Idris Jazari a UN human rights expert, even though when he was Algeria's ambassador, he personally led an aggressive campaign of non-democracies to muzzle UN human rights experts. Who selects them? Last year, the head of the Council panel that shortlists candidates was the representative of Saudi Arabia. If Eleanor Roosevelt were alive, would she not agree that electing the misogynistic regime of Saudi Arabia as chair was, in the words of Reporters Without Borders, grotesque? Mr. Chairman, we are actually about to mark a third anniversary. Next month, Geneva will celebrate the 200th anniversary since Mary Shelley and her husband joined Lord Byron and others at Villa Diodati in Geneva, right across from where the Council is today. In that cold and gloomy June of 1816, amid the darkness and storms of thunder and lightning, they exchanged ghost stories. Mary Shelley then had a nightmare, which she famously published, the story of an idealistic student who tried to create life, only to be horrified by its results, the story of Frankenstein. I often walk past Villa Diodati. When I gaze across Lake Geneva and see the UN Human Rights Council, I cannot help but wonder, if Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin were alive today and beheld the sight of a body that grotesquely legitimizes murderers, dictators, and anti-Semites, would they not be revolted by what has become of their creation? Would they not conclude that today's UN Human Rights Council has become Frankenstein's monster and their dream become a nightmare? Mr. Chairman, I believe the US and fellow democracies can and must fight back, as outlined in my written testimony, and about which I will be happy to elaborate. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Mr. Lyman, you recognize for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank members of the Commission for inviting me to participate in this hearing. I will use the few minutes available to try to both look back at the Council's achievements and shortfalls over the past 10 years and forwards to consider possible future reforms of the body. Turning first to the performance of the Council, I would offer two ways to analyse and understand that performance. One, by looking at broad linear trends, and two, by undertaking a comparative analysis of the Council's work as measured against its founding documents, in particular GA Resolution 6251. Seen in a linear sense, the first decade of the Council can be divided, I think, or I would suggest, into four phases. First, a difficult yet in the end, relatively successful birth, i.e. agreement on the Council's institution building package, a birth that took place largely in the absence of US engagement. A point which goes a long way towards explaining the main defect of the IBP, namely the decision to devote an entire agenda item, as we have heard, to Israel. 2, the second phase, an extremely difficult first 3 to 4 years. Those of us who were there will remember those years, during which time the US still remained largely disengaged. During that time, the Council was dominated and essentially controlled by a small group of states, including Algeria, Egypt, Cuba, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. These states used their coordinatorships of the Africa Group, the OIC, and the NAM to dictate the Council's decision-making and output. This early period reached its nadir when the Council convened a special session on Sri Lanka, and as we have heard, ended by congratulating the then government, in effect, for committing war crimes. The third phase saw a rapid upturn in fortunes with the decision of the US to join the Council in 2009. With the support of various moderate developing countries and its Western partners, the US was able to loosen the grip of the countries I mentioned a few moments ago. During this time, the Council scored important achievements vis-à-vis the situations in Libya, Sri Lanka, Eritrea, North Korea, and Iran, and in the context of norm development in areas such as combating religious intolerance, freedom of assembly, sexual orientation, and business and human rights. The US was key to all of these achievements. The last phase lasted roughly for the past 2 years and has been characterized by the reconfiguration of the aforementioned NAM-OIC countries, this time together with Russia, into a new bloc known as the like-minded group. This re-emergence has coincided with a series of very divisive votes on issues around sexual orientation, gender identity, and the protection of civil society space. The second framework to understand the Council over the past 10 years, I would suggest, is a comparative analysis based on a measurement against GA Resolution 6251. In the short term available to me, I will restrict myself to addressing a few key areas where the Council has fallen short, in my opinion, of its mandate. First, as we have heard, a core mandate of the Council is to address situations of violations of human rights, including gross and systematic violations. However, after 10 years of existence, there are significant question marks over whether the Council is fulfilling this core mandate. URG's analysis, which has been made available to the Commission, shows that only around 8% of the Council's resolutions are considered and adopted under Item 4, i.e. situations requiring the Council's attention. Even if one includes resolutions adopted under other relevant agenda items, then still only around a quarter of the Council's substantive output is focused on this supposedly core mandate of the Council. What is more, that output has addressed only around a dozen situations under Item 4, nearly all of them in Africa and the Middle East. It has also placed, as we have heard, a heavily disproportionate focus, around 60 resolutions, on Israel. This suggests the Council's attention is directed more by geopolitical considerations than by, to quote the IBP, the principles of impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity, as it should be. It is a similar story with Council mechanisms. Notwithstanding the welcome emergence of new mechanisms like commissions of inquiry, the Council has not been able to arrest the historic decline in the number of country-specific special procedures. Finally, the Council has not even begun to implement paragraph 5F of GA Resolution 6251, which makes clear that the Council shall, and I quote, contribute through dialogue and cooperation towards the prevention of human rights violations and respond promptly to human rights emergencies. A second core mandate of the Council, as set by world leaders, is to promote the full implementation of human rights obligations undertaken by states. The importance of implementation and follow-up for the effectiveness and credibility of the Council has been mentioned today and is fully reflected in GA Resolution 6251, which states, and I quote, "The methods of work of the Council shall be results-orientated, allow for subsequent follow-up discussions to recommendations and their implementation, and allow for substantive interaction with special procedures and mechanisms." Unfortunately, while the past 10 years has seen a huge increase in the number of resolutions adopted, from around 70 in 2008 to over 110 in 2014, a similarly huge increase in the number of recommendations to states by council mechanisms, and a big increase in the number of generic thematic debates, reports and panels, there's little evidence of systematic follow-up on the implementation of all of those recommendations and proposals. It is vital for the Council's credibility that this trend is reversed, so that we can finally together bridge the long-standing implementation gap. Finally, Mr. Chair, I would end by offering a few thoughts on areas for improvement and reform over the next 10 years. First, in order to improve its relevance and credibility, the Council must deal in a more systematic, principled and objective manner with situations of human rights violations, especially systematic and gross violations. To do so will require political will and creativity, and the US delegation will necessarily need to play a key role, as it has up until now. Two, linked with that point, the Council will need to put in place the processes and mechanisms to more effectively prevent the escalation of violations and human rights emergencies. Ideas in that regard have been mentioned this afternoon, such as objective criteria that would trigger action by the Council, new mechanisms to oversee country situations and compare them with those objective criteria, and perhaps new mechanisms to undertake preventative missions. Three, the Council will need to play a much more proactive role in promoting the implementation of universal norms, both by holding states accountable against their obligations and by delivering effective capacity building and technical support. Up until now, in my opinion, the Council has done neither satisfactorily. Four, UN regular budgetary funding for the human rights pillar must clearly be increased beyond the current 3%. Support should also be given to the High Commissioner's Change Initiative. Five, membership of the Council must, as we have heard, be improved. At present, the membership criteria contained in GA Resolution 6251 are largely ignored, with states, including Western states, voting on the basis of bilateral relationships rather than on the basis of the human rights performance of candidates. Ideas to improve this could be a voluntary voting country's pledge, or, as the Congressman suggested, the US and others publicly opposing certain candidatures. And lastly, the Council should remain open to dissenting views, the voice of civil society, NGOs and national human rights institutions. At present, some states are trying to reduce civil society space and to turn the Council and its mechanisms, such as the UPR, into, in effect, a peer-to-peer, friend-to-friend mutual appreciation society. It's imperative for the future of the Council and its credibility that the US continues to lead efforts to oppose such moves to stifle dissent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Thanks, each of the witnesses, for your testimony. I'll begin questioning and recognize myself for that purpose. Dr. Lagon, what, in your view, are the major human rights issues and situations that the Council should be addressing? In what ways do actions or inactions by UN bodies, including the Human Rights Council, affect these situations? If you'd elaborate on that.
Well, to be brief, I'd say my colleague, Hillel Neuer, points out the right thing, that China and Russia, as permanent 5 members of the Security Council, they have not been subject to scrutiny, and a huge portion of the world's population in China is not subject to scrutiny beyond the Universal Periodic Review. That may have more to do with a norm in the UN that P5 countries are left be, or the influence of those countries. If you ask me what situation in the world deserves the most focus, it's Syria, and it has gotten it at the Human Rights Council. So why is it that the work of the Human Rights Council on North Korea has actually managed to influence, shockingly, the Security Council to keep an agenda item on human rights, but there hasn't been an enormous influence in shaking the Security Council to take action in a bubbling, boiling set of atrocities in Syria. So we might want to think about the relationship of the bodies. So there's inaction or there's inefficacy of bodies that speak and then it doesn't go forward.
Would you please elaborate on the importance of the U.S. opposing election of Saudi Arabia to the Council?
I feel very strongly about this. Look, Saudi Arabia has a truly heinous record on women's rights. It's one reason why next Tuesday at our 75th anniversary celebration, Freedom House is going to be honoring with its Freedom Award Hala al-Dosari, an intellectual and blogger speaking up for women's rights in Saudi Arabia. But that's not the end of the story. Religious persecution is appalling in Saudi Arabia. Freedom House documents that the level of executions in Saudi Arabia rose to the highest level in 20 years last year. And let's think about Saudi Arabia. It exports Wahhabist extremism by underwriting schools around the world. It has helped Bahrain squash dissent brutally, and it's used indiscriminate force in Yemen. I asked the question, is this an ally in good standing of the United States? The United States will prove that it not only puts strategic competitors in the crosshairs on human rights if it stands up to fight Saudi Arabia. The United States and Saudi Arabia are sitting for their year off from the Council as required by its rules. The United States should not only fight to get back on the Council, but to fight for Saudi Arabia to be denied a seat.
Thank you. Mr. Picone, in your written testimony, you suggest that membership to the Council could be improved by states organizing a, quote, formal pledging conference, end quote, and committing to uphold the highest standards in protecting human rights. And you also suggest that regional groups could voluntarily commit to run only competitive slates. How would you suggest that states be incentivized to hold these conferences, and what incentives do members of regional groups have to run competitive slates?
Thank you very much for those questions. On the pledging conference, I think the heart of it is to put on the table for all of the member states of the General Assembly to consider a balanced review of how these states are implementing human rights norms and cooperating with the Council, which is another criterion for membership. And so if you started the conversation with, this state has not allowed an independent expert to visit the country, has not submitted its treaty body reports, has not, other ways it has interfered with the promotion and protection of human rights, I think that kind of shedding light, transparency, particularly if it's then surrounded by some media attention and civil society activism, would cause some states to step back and say, oh, maybe I don't want that scrutiny. I mean, when Saudi Arabia tries to run for a higher profile, what it's doing is only inviting more scrutiny on its own record, as Freedom House's testimony suggests. So sometimes that give and take in the halls of the UN and having more transparency about their records can lead to some changes on the margins. But I think at the end of the day, we have a fundamental problem in our international system, which is to put it crudely, three baskets of states. The authoritarian hardliners who are really going to resist no matter what, and it's very hard to have influence with them. You have, I would say, more human rights, pro-human rights states that are abiding by the rule of law in the United States and Europe in the lead there. And then you have a vast group of middle states that swing in between the two. And I have found in my research that a number of those states are much more open to influence by the international system. You have within those societies reformers who are willing to have the international scrutiny and use it as a stick and a leverage within their own societies to promote change. In terms of incentivizing, I think The competitive slates, maybe in the next 5 or 10-year review of the council, you could force that issue. It would require a rule change in the institutional structure of the council. For now, making it voluntary, certainly the U.S. should lead by example, and it should be willing to submit itself to a competitive slate, unlike the last time it ran. And I think we have to keep putting pressure, particularly on the African states. Where there's been a choice, most of the time, the states have voted for, particularly it's up with a question of power. The smaller states with bad records usually lose.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Neuer, 7 of the 24 Human Rights Council special sessions have focused on alleged Israeli human rights violations. You know, most people view this focus as imbalanced. How has this imbalance jeopardized the Council's credibility?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the selectivity against Israel was one of the flagship defects that Kofi Annan identified when he talked about selectivity and politicization. And indeed, one of the documents of the United Nations that were circulated around the time of the creation of the Council was a document talking about listing the special agenda item on Israel and its need to be removed. So I think certainly in the United States and in other countries, the obsessive treatment of Israel is regarded as a very significant manifestation of the Council's lack of credibility. And I think we should acknowledge the work of the U.S. at the Council, and certainly I recognize the outstanding work of Ambassador Harper and his team at the U.S. mission in Geneva in advancing human rights, helping us at UN Watch give a voice for victims, and when we and our dissidents are so often interrupted at the Council for defending our right to speak, as we recognize their work on Israel. At the same time, it would be unfortunate if the U.S. now finds itself in a position where they have to defend the Council's work. For example, in the first panel, I didn't hear a mention that in June 2010, there was the creation of an entirely new mechanism that didn't exist before. This was the flotilla incident off of Gaza when the IHH terrorist group tried to run the blockade and cause deaths. The Council convened in urgent session, which they called an urgent debate, because they actually were in session already. So they created an entirely new mechanism called an urgent debate, created a commission of inquiry, which was prejudicial. The verdict was declared in advance, which then produced an egregiously one-sided inquiry, which was a report which was contradicted by the UN itself about a year later by Sir Geoffrey Palmer in a more credible report that came out of New York. And this significant attack on Israel, this urgent debate, commission of inquiry, and report don't seem to be factored in when the State Department does their numbers, nor when we heard the number in the first panel of 1/5 of the resolutions deal with Israel. These are entirely inconsistent with the resolution, the numbers that we count quite scrupulously, and I believe the difference is that we're counting apples and oranges. When we count, we look at condemnations, and we count how many condemnations of Israel versus condemnations of other countries, whereas the State Department seems to be counting all country resolutions. And that is not a meaningful metric, because there are country resolutions that entirely praise those countries. For example, there was a resolution on Sudan which, quote, welcomed the commitment of the government of Sudan to protect and promote human rights in the country. That seems to be one of the resolutions that the State Department is counting in their overall measure. So too a resolution 29/24 on Cote d'Ivoire, which welcomes the exemplary and continuing cooperation of Cote d'Ivoire with the UN human rights machinery. It is not meaningful to count all country resolutions, especially those that praise dictatorships.
Thank you. Mr. Lyman, in your testimony, you mentioned the goal of mainstreaming the Human Rights Council. Would you elaborate on what this entails and the prospects of elevating the Council's position as well as human rights as a whole within the UN framework?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. It is a good question because nobody really understands what we mean by mainstreaming. It's there, and it's a key part of GA Resolution 6251. It's actually in operative paragraph 4 that the Human Rights Council should lead efforts on mainstreaming. It's also incredibly important if you bear in mind that the human rights pillar, as we've said, only gets 3% of the UN's regular budget, so it clearly needs to amplify those resources by promoting human rights across the other two pillars, across development and security. But the Human Rights Council has never really grasped with what that means in practice. It's often referred to as that other parts of the UN should take a human rights-based approach, but again, nobody has really ever defined what that is. What, in my opinion, the Human Rights Council needs to do is become much better at becoming a forum where the different parts of the UN family can come together to discuss how human rights can be promoted through other UN policy areas, but also how other UN policy areas can be improved in terms of the qualitative impact by adopting a rights-based approach. A very good example of this at the moment, of course, is the discussions around the Sustainable Development Goals. Mr. Chairman, you probably heard that there were various efforts to include human rights more explicitly within the Sustainable Development Goals. There was pushback against that from the same kind of states we've heard about today. But still, the human rights are there. They're in the preamble, and they're also there in SDG 16 about good governance and rule of law. So it's a legitimate and important discussion to have at the Human Rights Council about what is the role of the human rights system in promoting the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular by promoting human rights and promoting the implementation of obligations. And one thing that the Universal Rights Group has proposed in that regard would be to have a thematic special session on human rights in the SDGs. Another area of mainstreaming, of course, is human rights across the security pillar. So that's human rights missions as part of peacekeeping missions, but also greater connectivity between the Human Rights Council and the Security Council. At an event this morning with Brookings and the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we heard the High Commissioner admit that 7 years ago, human rights was not on the agenda of the Security Council, whereas now the High Commissioner for Human Rights regularly goes and briefs the Security Council about human rights situations. So there are things happening in the area of mainstreaming, but it's one area, in my opinion, that for the past 10 years, the Council has not really grasped the scale of the importance of this mandate.
Thank you. I have a question that I'd like all of you to respond to, and we'll start with you, Dr. Lagon. What role do you see for NGOs at the Human Rights Council? And would you be able to elaborate on the challenges currently facing NGOs that attempt to participate in the Council's deliberations?
I thank you for asking that. Some of my colleagues have addressed this briefly earlier. I think it's important not only for international NGOs like Freedom House to have a voice, but importantly, the NGOs from countries themselves that are being dealt with. And it's a move forward from the Commission that the Universal Periodic Review gives voice to those civil society groups because they can offer shadow reports or offer submissions that relate to the Universal Periodic Review. But when states cut off civil society organizations from being able to speak, or in New York at the Accreditation Committee, illiberal states' dictatorships purposefully target NGOs, asking them questions that are fanciful to try and prevent them from being accredited. When there are reprisals, when there are even global South democracies who turn their heads away from those reprisals against civil society or abet them, like the government of South Africa, that's really unfortunate.
Mr. McCone?
Yes. On the challenges, well, to say a couple points about on the positive side of the ledger, I mentioned that there's already more civil society participation in Geneva than in really any other part of the UN system. over time, there's been developed a network of human rights organizations from the North and the South, regional, national groups, international groups that are working much more cohesively and coordinating common positions and joint statements on issues, and then lobbying back in their capitals with much greater authority than if it were just coming from Washington or New York, say Human Rights Watch or Amnesty. There's a much more diverse and rich grouping of human rights groups that are actively lobbying their governments in the global South as well as the global North, and that's a positive development. Also, I would agree on the UPR process. In my research, I've talked to many activists who say before the UPR process, they couldn't get their foot in the door with a government official to talk about human rights. Now, because the government has a concern about their reputation, they're presenting their human rights record in Geneva, they're willing to engage with civil society, coordinate across ministries and with their groups and consulting them before they go to Geneva. It's a small step, but it's where it begins in that kind of dialogue. It's not only about naming and shaming. On the challenges I mentioned reprisals is a major problem, and I think the High Commissioner and the last president of the Human Rights Council in particular was very actively speaking out on that issue and trying to respond actively to cases where there are reprisals. And then the NGO committee, I mean, some of us on this panel have had our own experience of harassment from the NGO committee where states just ask over and over again the same questions just to string out and delay and distract us from the hard work we're trying to do on human rights issues. So that's why I call for a total overhaul of that body.
Mr. Neuer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to agree with Ted that the role of NGOs in Geneva at the Human Rights Council is a very significant opportunity for human rights victims from around the world to be heard, and certainly UN Watch, a big part of our work at the regular and special sessions is bringing those victims and giving them a platform, even if they are so often insulted and harassed at the Council. One issue which I again want to emphasize is the Committee on NGOs headed by 19 governments. To our knowledge, the membership has never been more hostile. The membership includes Iran, Russia, China, Cuba, Pakistan, Venezuela, Turkey, Sudan, Burundi, Mauritania, which has slavery, Nicaragua, Guinea, and Azerbaijan. These countries are not just on the 19-member committee, they dominate that committee. On typical votes, you might have 11 dictatorships or non-democracies and 4 or 5 democracies that vote the right way, and a handful of democracies that either abstain or vote the wrong way. That is a critical stumbling block, and it's been mentioned before. The U.S. And its allies need to invest more effort way in advance to ensure that that committee has a different kind of composition so that NGOs are not prevented from speaking at the UN. Second critical issue about NGOs is that most NGOs are doing great work. There are a handful of NGOs that are fake, that are what we call gongos, government-organized NGOs. The Assad regime has an NGO that regularly speaks to make its case. The genocidal regime of Sudan has several NGOs that make its case. These are all run by the regime. We did an event on Darfur and had a so-called NGO come and say that they're from Darfur and that no one should talk about Darfur because everything's fine there. Finally, perhaps the most notorious incident, a couple years ago we brought Tiana Wang, the 24-year-old student whose father, Wang Binzhang, is the democracy pioneer in prison in China as a political prisoner. We brought her to speak at the council, and it emerged that while she was sitting among the NGOs, there were Chinese agents wearing NGO badges belonging to an accredited NGO who were spying on her, were taking pictures of her body, of her computer screen. They were caught by UN security. These Chinese agents, they were taken outside, and I think for a day or two they had their credentials removed, but when we complained formally to the council, and this was reported, there were 2 articles in the New York Times about this. The New York Times reporter in Beijing actually went to the address of the so-called NGO, and it turns out it's like the Chinese Pentagon where that NGO, so-called NGO, is based. And there were no measures in response by the council to China. And so this is something to be aware of, how the NGO system is being subverted. And just last year, we saw Hamas, the terrorist group, have a phony NGO based out of London called the Palestine Return Center. they got recognized as an NGO. Many democracy groups can't be recognized, but a Hamas front group was recognized despite the efforts of the US and many major democracies who tried to vote against it. They had the majority with Iran and Sudan, and they won. That's something to be aware of.
Thank you. Mr. Lyman?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. I would agree with Ted that we should also remember the positive side of the ledger, and that is that Geneva or the Human Rights Council are relatively open to NGO participation, especially when compared with the General Assembly in New York. But clearly, that space is under threat, and there's more that can be done. I would highlight, especially in that regard, the Universal Periodic Review, which, as we've heard today, is held out now as a success story of the Human Rights Council in its first 10 years. And I agree that it is a success story. However, we have, as we've heard, it's based on peer-to-peer review, which means that states themselves, in the second round, submit information on whether or not they have implemented recommendations from the first round. This information is then considered in the UPR working group without the participation of civil society and without the participation of the national human rights institutions. What does this mean in practice? It means that, as somebody mentioned earlier, it's a kind of beauty pageant that states say, we have done this, we have done that, and there's no dissenting voice in the UPR working group. Why? Evidence of that being a problem, that according to Universal Rights Group's analysis, if we believe the state's own reports under the UPR, then around 50% of all recommendations they received in the first cycle were fully implemented, and a further 20% of all recommendations were partially implemented, which in my estimation would make it the most successful compliance mechanism in the history of the UN. There's something clearly not right, and what's not right, in my opinion, is that we don't have that kind of shadow dissenting view. The NGOs can produce and do produce an other stakeholders report, but that report is often ignored by states in the UPR working group. Mr. Chair, you may be aware the Human Rights Council is currently considering possible necessary reforms ahead of the third cycle of the UPR, and I would respectfully suggest that the US should push for greater civil society involvement in the UPR working group to make sure that the dissenting view can be heard. And just to express my agreement that the NGO committee in New York, which accredits NGOs, really is in need of a complete overhaul. And the Universal Rights Group is currently up in front of that NGO committee. So I will tell you in a couple of weeks' time just how much in need of overhaul it is or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very informative hearing. I don't want to cut anyone off, but it's 5 o'clock and we're supposed to end. Are there any concluding statements anyone wishes to make? If not, yes, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Neuer.
Yes, once again, I want to reiterate that UN Watch supports robust engagement to try to make the Council work to live up to the dream of its founders. At the same time, we think it's important, and we've published this before, that the U.S. not find itself in a position where it becomes an apologist for the Council's worst abuses. And as I detailed in my written testimony, on a number of occasions, the U.S. has seemed to have adopted a rule whereby it needs to defend the actions of the Council. And I have in mind when the Saudi was elected to chair the committee that names human rights experts for the world, and Ambassador Power was asked about this, she said, well, it's only procedural. Well, perhaps when the Congress confirms judges on the Supreme Court, that's also a procedure. That's an enormously influential position, and the world was rightly outraged that the Saudi was given that job. So I think we see a dynamic where the U.S. feels the need to justify things that are happening at the Council beyond that which is truly defensible. Again, we appreciate engagement, we support it, but it should not be at the expense of critical engagement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks all the witnesses for your testimony. Very, very good contribution here today, and I'd like to thank you and members of the Commission for their commitment to advocating for human rights around the globe. It's clear that there's much work to be done, after 10 years of operations, 31 regular sessions, 24 special sessions. The UN Human Rights Council has yet to address some of the world's most blatant human rights violations. China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, others appear to have received almost complete immunity, and the lack of a single resolution even introduced, let alone passed, against so many serious violators is a stark testament to the geopolitical considerations that often outweigh concerns for human rights at the Council. Yet there's cause for hope. The action taken on Iran, Syria, Burma should not be forgotten. The recent robust investigation by the Commission of Inquiry into the atrocities committed in North Korea highlighted many gross and systematic abuses that had previously gone unacknowledged by the UN. And these successes, however, risk being overshadowed by the many other issues at the Council, a Council whose membership includes states like Vietnam and Venezuela, two nations well known for forcefully suppressing freedom of speech. Political liberties will never be accepted as credible, and the practice of clean slate elections should be brought to an end so that genuine competition for membership requiring nations to demonstrate through action their commitment to protecting human rights can take place. Furthermore, the critical role played by NGOs at the Council is under threat. The 19-member UN Committee on NGOs, whose membership includes Sudan and Iran, is abusing its role in the NGO approval process to try and deter legitimate non-governmental organizations from participating in Council activities, and these efforts would muzzle or silence independent human rights monitors who provide a critical perspective to the Council's deliberations. I must commend Ambassador Harper, Deputy Assistant Secretary Barclay, and Deputy Assistant Secretary Busby for their earnest efforts to strengthen U.S. leadership at the Council and address many of the concerns raised here today. It's undoubtedly a difficult and thankless task. And I must also recognize significant work of the NGOs here today who have spent countless hours working to shine a light on the Council and improve its ability to effectively address some of the great concerns of our time. I look forward to working with all of these distinguished individuals in the days ahead. Together, we can help strengthen U.S. leadership on the human rights fronts while encouraging the international community to prioritize the issues of fundamental freedoms, which we all hold dear. Thank you very much for your participation, your attention. With that, this hearing is adjourned.